So I think we can get started. As I said, I'm Kathy Cavallari. I'm president of the Westborough Historical Society. I'm delighted you've joined us this evening. Good evening and welcome. The Westborough Historical Society was founded in 1889 to preserve local history through research programs and the preservation of artifacts. Our headquarters is located at the Sibley House, which is an 1844 Greek Revival home of the sleigh maker, William Sibley. That house is located at 13 Parkman Street, up from the library. And inside we have a museum that houses 3 centuries of artifacts of Westborough history, dating back to the founding of the town in 1717. So hopefully in better times in the spring, beyond COVID mania, we will be able to reopen our house for open houses and tours. For more than a century, the Society's mission has been to celebrate local history and bring that history to life through our monthly presentations, through Sibley House tours, and special events. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, which I'm sure you will, I encourage you to like our Facebook page, which is Westborough Historical Society, and check out our website, www.westboroughhistory.org. And you can also become a member through the website, and we'd love to have you as a member. As I said a little bit ago, we are going to be using the chat this evening for questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. People will be muted for the presentation. And the program is being recorded for later rebroadcast by Westborough TV, which should be available on their page and site within a few days. If you don't, they usually just show the speakers, but if you're, for your comfort, if you wish, you can turn your video off if you want a little more privacy. And I do want to mention that tonight's program is generously sponsored by the Westborough Civic Club, many of whose members are probably with us tonight. And we want to say thank you to them for sponsoring Professor Railton. So our topic is remembering the 1918 influenza pandemic in the age of COVID with Professor Ben Railton. He's professor of English and American Studies at Fitchburg State University. Professor Railton has a Bachelor of Arts magna cum laude from Harvard University in American History and Literature, and he has a PhD from Temple University. He's the author of 6 books, most recently, the book Of the I Sing, The Contested History of American Patriotism, which was published in 2021. His scholarship includes the daily American Studies blog, the bi-monthly Considering History column for the Saturday Evening Post, and contributions to online conversations, including HuffPost and We're History. He's also a prolific public scholarly tweeter at American Studier. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Ben Railton.
All right, thank you so much, Kathy, and the Westborough Historical Society, and certainly the Westborough Civic Club as well, as Kathy mentioned, for all helping make this happen, and to Pete Allen for all the technological wizardry, at least to me, it's all wizardry for sure, to help make it all go smoothly, and to Chris Allen as well. For connecting me to you all, initially through the WISE program, the Adult Learning Program at Assumption College in Worcester, where I had the chance to talk a bit about these histories as part of a class on the 1920s and get connected to you all and have a chance to keep thinking about them. And most of all, thank you to you for being here, to you all for being here on a Monday night here in January to be part of this conversation. And that's the last thing I'll emphasize before I share my slides and get into talking about these things a bit. I definitely do see it as a conversation, as one part of an ongoing conversation, any talk like this. And that means a couple of things. It certainly means tonight, I really hope to hear from you. As Kathy had mentioned, there's a couple ways that you can do that as we go. If you have questions, if things come up that you want to follow up on or talk more about or share, please do put those in chat if you would. And then if they feel relevant to sort of the particular topics, Kathy is free and I know she's free to interrupt me, particularly when we get to maybe the quick breaks between the 3 sections. So you can ask and have conversation then, but definitely at the end as well, there should be some good time for extended conversation. So please, if you haven't yet, put questions or thoughts in chat at that, make sure to do it at that point at the end of the talk tonight. But then lastly, in terms of a conversation, my final slide is my contact info. You can find me online in various ways as well, very easily. And I'd love to keep hearing from you beyond this evening. So keep questions and thoughts and follow-up ideas and conversation of all kinds going after tonight. Email's a great way to do that, but any way that you want to find me and check in is very welcome. So look forward to the conversation, not just tonight, but beyond as well. All right, so in one of the two phrases that have defined our last 2 years, let me share my screen. The other one is, I think you're muted, but I'm not muted, so at least I can avoid that particular 2020 legacy. And just a quick note on, again, the structure of the topic with the talk with the title that Kathy had mentioned. 3 sections and 2 quick things about that, and then I'll get into the first of them. One, again, I am going to pause just for kind of a second at the end of each section, not a full Q&A conversation yet, because we'll definitely get to that at the end. But I'm pausing there not only to pause and shift gears a little, but so that if there are questions that have come up that feel specific enough or connected to particular things from those sections enough, then Kathy can raise them. So again, if you have things as I go, please do share them, and there will be opportunities to get them in the mix. And then the second thing I just quickly wanted to say, and you can, I guess, kind of see it in looking at these 3 topics and the framing of them, I am interested in the histories themselves. I always am interested in that, and I try to focus on different layers to them that help us think about the complexity, the multiple layers, the nuance, the contradictions, the levels of any moment, all of our histories, all of our moments throughout American history. But in my own work, in my own focus, I'm at least as interested in, maybe even a little bit more in a 21st century context, of how we forget and remember our collective memories, our national narratives, how we think about or don't think about our histories, our identities, our stories, our collective American study. And so that is the second and third sections in a lot of ways, both still focused on figures and texts from this period, but opening up to that question as well of forgetting and remembering, and some of the ways that we have not and can better remember the influenza pandemic of the late 19-teens and early 1920s. Because one of my central contentions in this, before we get into the details of the pandemic a little, one of my central ideas, particularly as of 2 years ago, of course it has changed, is how strikingly absent this moment was from so much of our collective memory, even in its own era, is part of what I'm arguing here, even in the 1920s in a lot of ways. And I was part of that. I very rarely thought about this pandemic until a couple of years ago, even though I've dedicated my life and career to all things American studies. There was a huge gap there, and there are lots of reasons or ways to think about that gap. I'm going to try to think about a few, but ultimately, I think the main point is to try to remember that as well. Not only remember the history, but remember how poorly we did remember it for so long, at least in part so we can try to make sure that we don't replicate that error, that we do a better job remembering as we move forward, remembering the influenza pandemic, and of course, remembering our own as well. And on that note, I'll just say I'm going to focus mostly on the 19-teens and 20s tonight. I'll try to reference echoes and contexts and legacies here in the 21st century for sure. I hope that they're there. I hope that you can keep thinking about them, and I'll certainly be happy to keep talking about our 21st century moment in conversation as well. All right, so just a few layers to the histories themselves, to the multi-year, multi-level history of the influenza pandemic, specifically here in the United States, is mostly my focus. Obviously, this was a truly global pandemic, just as, of course, COVID has been in our own moment, and one that every country experienced in its own ways, every continent experienced in its own ways. And there would be lots to say beyond this talk and beyond my expertise, for sure, about that global question and the global history of the influenza pandemic. I'm thinking about it tonight mostly from an American perspective. I will also note, I put one link here at the top of this slide, which is a link to a column of mine for that Saturday Evening Post column that Kathy mentioned. Right toward the start of COVID, I started to think myself a little bit more about this pandemic and wrote a column about that. I didn't include a lot of other links in this talk. I certainly would be happy, particularly if you want to email me afterward, to share some of the folks I've read and learned from, because of course, like all of us, I continue to learn about these things from so many voices and perspectives. One who I will mention is a historian at Oregon State named Christopher McNichols. He's one of the best folks right now working on the influenza pandemic. He just had a column in the Washington Post's Made by History series this past week on Omicron, kind of in the context of the ongoing influenza pandemic around 1920. So great voice to search out Christopher McNichols. One of many, though, and I'd be happy to share those kind of details if you want to reach out. So again, a truly global pandemic, if one that also had a very, very tangible effect here in the United States. But over this 2-year and a bit period, almost 500 million people, which was about a third of the population of the Earth at that time, as it's been estimated. Of course, these things are estimates, but pretty closely tracked estimates, were infected over those 2 and a bit years across 4 distinct waves, as historians have documented it. And about 10% of those infected, 50 million or so, died. So a hugely widespread, hugely prominent, and hugely fatal, hugely destructive pandemic. There had, of course, been various pandemics and epidemics over the centuries since, like the Black Plague until the influenza epidemic, smallpox multiple times in the 19th century, among others. But by all accounts, this was really the most significant global pandemic, at least since the Black Plague, and maybe even more fully global than that. And again, hugely widespread, hugely destructive, and lasting for a very long period of time, particularly in that 20th century context. And besides that general spread and destructiveness, it was particularly destructive toward younger people. And that was part of what made it so kind of striking and shocking, particularly, Kathy was mentioning this before the talk, and to echo her good point, particularly if you think about it in the immediate aftermath of World War I, which killed so many young men in particular, in Europe especially, to have another global destructive force that was killing young people, and particularly 20-something young adults passed away at a much higher rate than was normally the case with influenza, which tends to target both children and older adults, and often than some of those other pandemics in general. This was a striking pandemic in that way as well, that it really took healthy 20-somethings at a strikingly high mortality rate compared to the norm. And all of that made it, again, hugely disastrous and prominent, the center in a lot of ways of the global conversation for these 2+ years, and certainly of the American conversation as well. As you see those stats there at the bottom, huge number of Americans were infected over this period, something like 29-30 million Americans, a strikingly large percentage of the nation's population. And a lot of them, like globally, passed away, something like 750,000, which was about 6 times as many Americans as had died in World War I. And that's a point that I'll come back to in a few minutes when it comes to collective memory and what we did and didn't remember into the 1920s. World War I, of course, affected the U.S., particularly those soldiers who traveled to Europe after the U.S. joined the war, but it was somewhat targeted in that way. And the influenza pandemic was spread throughout the U.S. so fully and so destructively, and took so many American lives in that couple-year period. And so hugely destructive here as well as globally. So a few other layers that I wanted to briefly mention. One thing that I think is really important, and I've struggled with this a lot because it's very easy to use shorthand ways to describe things like this. And Spanish flu was, for a long time, when this pandemic was remembered at all, which it often was not, as I'll get to, it was often remembered through that phrase, that shorthand phrase, that sort of easy phrase for describing this illness that caused this pandemic, that was the center of this pandemic. But like so much of the time, and certainly like some of the ones we've seen in the last couple of years with COVID, this phrase was not only reductive, but pretty inaccurate, pretty strikingly inaccurate, at least in terms of where and how this pandemic seems to have developed. And in fact, this pandemic seems to have started, if we can pinpoint a start, which is an arguable point among historians, but the consensus seems to be that it was here in the United States at a U.S. Military camp in Kansas, Camp Funston, where recruits were training for that new war effort that the U.S. had recently entered in March 1918 to journey to Europe and take part in the Great War. That's the earliest documented outbreak of this pandemic or of this influenza. That would be the center, the starting point of the pandemic. Soldiers then, it seems, took it overseas. It began to spread, particularly among soldiers and armies there in Europe, in the European theater, and then became hugely prominent in many different European nations, and then gradually the whole world. But at least in part because of the war, and because both of practical concerns of of maintaining the morale of the troops, and also because of propagandistic concerns of not wanting to look weak to other nations, to enemies, and so on. Those outbreaks were underreported for quite a long time. And so there was documented information that this was happening, but it was not being widely reported, certainly not in the media, in the mass media. Whereas Spain, one of those European nations that became affected, but one that was neutral in the Great War at the time, didn't have those concerns of military morale or propagandistic needs. And so the media began to report more quickly and fully that this influenza was spreading. And so it became a focus of stories about this pandemic, leading to this myth that it was in Spain that the influenza originated and that the spread began, and leading to this name, the Spanish flu. So I don't mean to suggest that the name is necessarily sort of racist or something. There were complicated practical reasons why that association developed. But I certainly would say that continued use of the phrase, and I've seen it used to this day in many different contexts, is a lot more troubling and problematic because we know better. We very well know better, and yet it continues to be described in that way. Certainly you can see at least there the power, not only of these reductive shorthands, but of association and the way things like disease can become associated with particular nations, communities, peoples, in some pretty limiting and even often blatantly inaccurate ways. And that certainly, I think, is the case with Spanish flu, with that phrase, which I have had to try my best to unlearn, because if and when I did think about this pandemic, it was the phrase that I thought about. So a couple other contexts to add in. This is very small text, I know. I apologize. It's a couple paragraphs from that column I noted. I share it, so down the road, if you're interested, you can take a look. But I mainly wanted to highlight a couple things about how the pandemic spread in the United States, because the second wave in particular is really telling and really strikingly representative, unfortunately, of things we've continued to see into our 21st century moment. Because over 1918, over the summer of 1918, it seemed that the pandemic was being controlled, both because of summer months and summer weather, and because of a huge variety of means of pandemic mitigation, including things like masks and isolation and public health measures. And then came the second wave in late 1918. And the reasons for the second wave were both a desire to move past, an emphasis on other collective needs and collective goals, and quite frankly, public health misinformation and purposeful misinformation. So the US had entered the war, and there was a desire to support that war effort, and of course to get out into public after some months of isolation and quarantine and the like. And so Philadelphia planned this giant parade in September 1918, even though there had started to be signs that the pandemic was coming back, that new spread was happening, particularly in military camps again. And yet Philadelphia goes ahead with this plan for this giant parade to raise money for war bonds, to support the new war effort, and to get people out, hundreds of thousands of people out, in an understandable but ultimately hugely destructive desire for that kind of gathering, that kind of collective space. And public health voices and media voices both facilitated that unfortunate second wave. The director of public health in Philadelphia, Wilmer Cruson, as you see in the first paragraph here, scoffed at the idea that the event should be canceled. He said this was just the old-fashioned influenza or grip, and if people just didn't sneeze on each other, they'd be fine. And hundreds of thousands of Philadelphians heeded his and others' advice and came out to watch this parade in September 28th. And then within 72 hours, the spread had exploded in Philly. Every bed was filled in their 31 hospitals. 2,600 people died over the next week, 4,500 over the week after, and the launch of the spread was on from there. But even while those thousands and thousands of deaths were occurring, a Philadelphia Inquirer editorial asked Philadelphians, as you see in the second paragraph, to talk of cheerful things instead of disease. The authorities seem to be going daft. What are they trying to do? Scare everybody to death? And so I think you can see, again, not only how waves can happen, but also how public health voices, or ostensibly public health voices, political voices, media voices, can add to that possibility of spread, or at least not in any way help to mitigate or to stop it. And Philadelphia was a center of that, and that soon became a nationwide phenomenon as this huge second wave took off that really exploded the pandemic into 1919 and after. And then one other context that I'll mention, there's a lot more to say, and I want to get to these other couple of topics, of course, but I did also just want to note, I said briefly already that things like masking were certainly present. in 1918, 1919, 1920. So too were debates over masks, very prominent public nationwide debates. The idea that I hear sometimes by way of critique of our current moment, and I have plenty of critiques of our current moment, but the idea that it's new for people to, for example, be so resistant and so critical of the idea of masks in a pandemic is not true. There were strikingly prominent, significant anti-mask, not just individuals, but communities during the influenza pandemic, including this famous one in San Francisco, the Anti-Mask League of San Francisco, who were founded not even at the beginning of the pandemic when things may have seemed slightly more under control, but during that second wave, which was an even more strikingly kind of quickly spreading and widespread and destructive wave. It was December 1918. There was a new mask ordinance passed in that city because of that rapidly spreading and destructive second wave. And political opponents of the mayor of that city, and also just anti-mask activists, individuals and communities who were critical of it and attacking this public health measure, gathered together to hold public meetings, to hold rallies and sort of semi-riots anyway, riotous rallies to rhetorically attack public officials like Mayor Rolfe at public events and occasions, to argue as vociferously as they could for freedom and liberty in the face of this second mask mandate. Eventually, the mayor gave in to the pressure of the Anti-Mask League in San Francisco, repealed the mask ordinance in February, and any sense that the pandemic was past or that was going to be an acceptable measure was unfortunately defeated later that year with the arrival of the third wave, which hit San Francisco even harder still, as historians have documented. About 30 out of every 1,000 residents in that city died of the disease by the time the pandemic was over. So lots of layers to that debate, political ones, ideological ones, public health debates. But at the end of the day, prominent voices, individual and communal, who pushed back on these kind of measures eventually, at least in part, contributed to their end and certainly didn't help mitigate the continued spread of that disease into its third and fourth waves over the next couple of years. So it's worth noting that those kind of debates and those kind of conflicts and their potential aftermaths and legacies were very much a part of this pandemic, just as we've seen in our own moment as well. All right, I'm in a second getting to my second topic, which is this question of forgetting, but
we have one comment from Phyllis Jaffe to everyone that her grandmother in Philadelphia died in the pandemic in 1918.
Oh, wow.
That's it.
Thank you, Phyllis, for sharing that. That's, I think it's worth being clear, right? Again, that is a good transition maybe then to forgetting, because it's not just that culture and literature tended not to represent this pandemic for a long, long time, and that's what I'm going to mainly talk about in a second. But it's certainly important to recognize when you think about that number, 50 million people worldwide, but almost a million Americans, 750,000 Americans who died of the influenza, and of course, many, many more millions who were infected. How many people then are part of that legacy, right? Families that were affected, multiple generations that are connected to those legacies. So this is a moment that has so much of a legacy in our lives, in our families, in our stories, much more, for example, than World War I in terms of just the number of people who were affected. And so I'm talking here about forgetting and remembering on the kind of collective level, but it's certainly worth thinking about the individual level and the family level. And
we have a couple more comments. Just Tom Morgan notes that he had an uncle die as an infant in 1918. And Mark Lippitt just wonders, was there a seasonality to 1918 as there is now?
Yes, that's my sense of it. Again, certainly the summer of 18, it seemed to be mitigating a bit in one way or another, and then it returned with a vengeance in the fall. And then that third wave was something like February and March of 1919, the kind of depth of winter, particularly in San Francisco, for example. So yes, I do think seasons played a part. But one thing that was really frustrating then, and I think is such a legacy as well, was that as those seasonal changes happened, they led to these retrenchments of the mitigation measures, right? So Philly says, okay, it's passed in September, and holds a giant parade. And San Francisco says, okay, we can stop masking because it seems to be lessening. So the seasonality wasn't sort of used predictively, let's say, to think about the ongoing potential, right? It was treated as the end, which I can well understand, but was unfortunately I think, a big cause of the third and fourth waves in particular, into 1920, well into 1920. And so that all then also leads into the second topic. And I don't want to beat this over the head too much, but I do think it's important to note on multiple levels, not only in like the 1980s and 90s when I was going through public school and college and grad school and not learning or even talking or thinking about the influenza pandemic, but in the 1920s, how much this moment seems to have been forgotten. And I think there's a way to frame that even within this idea of the lost generation, which is the phrase for the generation of young people, young writers, young artists, young people coming up in the 19-teens into the 1920s, first really quoted by Ernest Hemingway, quoting Gertrude Stein in the epigraph to his book, The Sun Also Rises, You Are All a Lost Generation. When that has generally been discussed, that concept, that phrase, that idea, certainly when I thought about it for decades, I thought about World War I and all the losses that it brought, both literal and then other losses, loss of faith, loss of certainty about the world, et cetera, and about just generally some of what that generation had experienced, the generation born between the late 1880s into the early 1900s, so many rapid changes and shifts in technologies and so on. But very rarely, as I say here, and as in my own thinking, connected to the pandemic, particularly, again, the idea of young adults being so affected by a disease, by a pandemic, which is a really striking thing and a significantly different thing about this one. And so if you look, for example, on the Wikipedia page for Lost Generation, it has many, many different subheadings, and there's no subheading for the pandemic. It's like a small piece under one much larger group of categories about like other social events. And so this influenza pandemic was lost, seems to have been lost in our thinking, but again, also in the thinking of the period, in really striking ways. And again, I don't want to dwell on this. I'm not going to talk about every one of these texts at length, but I think it's really important to note that this didn't just happen in the late 20th century. It happened immediately. When you look at, I'm talking about American Lit specifically, I think you could probably make the same case elsewhere, but in American Lit specifically, when you look at many of the most important, influential literary and cultural works of the decade, across a wide range of different identities, communities, topics, stories, there's really no mention at all of this 2+ year incredibly destructive force, and one that affected so many people so fully, including all the kinds of folks and family connections we were just hearing about. I was saying before the talk, so I'll highlight it here. A great example, a really great example to me, is The Great Gatsby, a novel that is precisely about what the past means for all these people in the mid 1920s, right? 1922, I believe, is the time period setting of that book. I looked at it for this talk, I apologize, but I think it's 1922 when those parties are happening in Gatsby. Maybe it's 23. So just a couple years after the end of the pandemic, group of people who are fixated on the past. And yet the only recent past they're fixated on is World War I and its era, right? Even though, while some of them fought, particularly Gatsby and Nick, our narrator, many of them didn't fight at all, had no direct relationship to it. They all lived through the influenza pandemic, of course, and it never comes up. It isn't mentioned once. A couple years after it happened in the setting, 5 years or so after the end of it in the publication of the novel. And you could say the same about all these different texts, most of which are about things like the influence of the past on the present and social dynamics and community experiences. Langston Hughes's amazing poems about Harlem in the 1920s and after, and just the richness of those communities that he's writing about and building. And yet, in my sense, and I've taught all of these many times and read them many times as well, no specific references to the pandemic from any of these works as characters, narrators, communities, dialogue, conversations, just this huge absence in the 1920s in literature and culture. Not all of it. I'll get to some places where it was present in a few minutes, but huge absences. And I think one way to think about that that's really a representative or telling in our own moment is to think as well about what does happen in the 20s, which is this idea of excess and celebration and party, the roaring 20s, which likewise is not something that develops historically, but is used in the era, is very much part of the 20s and the way that decade unfolds. There again, that decade and that frame has usually been related to World War I, the lost generation, some of those kind of existing narratives, and to lots of other stuff that's happening in the 20s, the golden 20s as they were known, economic prosperity, the quick development of things like the automobile as a widespread possibility for Americans, Hollywood and films, and so on. But I think it really helps to reframe the Roaring 20s in relationship to the pandemic and in relationship to all those literary and cultural works that are about the Roaring 20s in a lot of ways, and equally disappearing of the pandemic in their texts. One is the understandable need to party, to celebrate, to live in the present. Just as Philly, of course, tried to there in September 1918, far too early. By this time, the pandemic had ended through somewhat those mitigation measures, and also, it seems to historians, through just global spread. It infected so many people that eventually it reached a critical mass, it seemed. I don't know if and when we'll get to that point these days. But in any case, by late 1920, the influenza pandemic had largely petered out. Influenza remained, of course, but the pandemic experience of it was largely over. And so then this need to celebrate, this need to live in the present and to embrace an absence of not only memory, but perhaps worry about the future, and instead to try to live as much as possible in those present moments and communities and events. It's an understandable goal, it's an understandable desire, but it's coupled with, it seems, in the 1920s, it's coupled with this desire to forget, not to say learn from that past or to carry it forward into those parties, but to leave it behind entirely, to forget it, to pretend it never happened. And again, our literature and culture much of the time seems to really fully pretend it never happened, and to live instead in this present when the past is absent or even just destructive, right? Think about Gatsby. Part of the problem with Gatsby is he can't escape. He keeps trying to relive this past. And it's partly what brings him down. It's partly what destroys his present and his present dreams. So to just pretend that there is no past, that it's all that present moment as best we can, seems to be a huge part of this Roaring 20s moment, particularly inspired, I would argue, by an experience like that pandemic, but really problematically, really destructively. And before I get to a couple examples of remembering, I just want to dwell on that point for a second, that this isn't an absence that was just created after the fact in the late 20th century. That's when I experienced it. That's when I didn't learn about it, when I didn't have these conversations. And that had its own reasons in education and conversations in the late 20th century. But it's an absence that's created immediately. It's an absence that's created across a wide range of literature and culture, at least here in the United States, and through a general societal set of emphases and collective celebratory, present-focused ideals and experiences. And while understandable, I would argue that's incredibly limiting in the present, but certainly destructive for the future. Am I saying that if we better remembered the influenza pandemic, we wouldn't be in this one right now? No, I'm not saying that, but it would help to have had more collective memory. It would help to have a better way to engage with our past and what we can take from it than we too often do. And this is a great example of that. That absence, that forgetting, I think, was a part of our inability to quickly or collectively grapple and continue to have such problems collectively grappling with what our own moment is dealing with our own pandemic, with our own experiences. And that's across the board. A point I would make about collective memory: the better, the richer, the more nuanced, the more layered, the more we can take from it. The more absent, the more forgotten, the more lost, the less ability we have to navigate and understand where we are in the present. And I think we can really see that when it comes to the influenza pandemic. Fortunately, we don't just need historians or collective memory. We have authors and texts who thought about it in the 1920s and after as well. And I just want to highlight three of them quickly in my last section here for a couple minutes, but I'll pause for a sec. Kathy, was there anything?
Yeah, well, I think you've answered it, but Philomena Fagan wanted to know, to what extent is the 1918 pandemic connected with all this huge societal changes in the Roaring 20s? So I think you've kind of covered that, all that partying and wanting to forget and, move on with life and, but if you'd like to comment any further.
No, I think, yeah, I mean, that for sure. I think there would also be interesting ways to think about it in terms of just sort of what happens economically, right? Economic sort of, like after a war, for example, the back and forth between economics between destruction and then sort of subsequent economic boom and prosperity, but that seems to be papering over, right? That seems to be not allowing us maybe to process the losses as much as we could. So I think there's a lot of ways to connect the 20s to the pandemic, more than World War I in the United States. Again, so much of US collective memory has gone World War I into the 1920s, but I think the pandemic into the 20s is the more widespread and broad and deep connection. So it's a great question to keep thinking about for sure, I would say. And again, there are authors who do that thinking in the era. So just to highlight three of them for a second. One, Catherine Ann Porter, generally underread here in the 21st century, I would say. Really interesting modernist American writer who almost dies from the pandemic. She had been ill for much of her young life. As a teenager, she got what seemed to be tuberculosis. Later, it was diagnosed as bronchitis. She spent a couple years in a hospital, in a sanatorium, even before the pandemic. And then, while still a very young person in her early 20s, she goes out to Denver. She's writing as a journalist for a paper there, and gets influenza as part of the spreading pandemic, and is hospitalized as well, and almost dies, it seems. Has huge physical effects that linger with her and maybe are partly what make it harder for her to forget. Loses all of her hair as a result of that experience, for example, and it grows back fully white as a 20-something. So perhaps in part because of that experience, and certainly because of her sensibilities, she tries to remember, particularly in a trio of novels later in her life that are under the collective title Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which includes that book and two others, as I mentioned. And the title novella in particular, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, is very autobiographical, although not entirely. She connects it to the war. Interestingly, she connects the young woman suffering from influenza to a World War I soldier who then dies from the pandemic as a result of caring for her. So linking the war and the pandemic in some really interesting ways in that book. And one of the only modernist literary figures to really bring the pandemic into her writing, into her literary work in these ways. So much so that one of the first historians to write about the epidemic, Alfred Crosby, in his book Epidemic and Peace, 1918, dedicates that book to Porter as one of the voices who had kind of helped keep those histories alive through her literary work, through her writing, for later historians to engage with. A second one, I don't think you can see the thing that I see on my screen, but so it's not blocking his full name, William Keepers Maxwell Jr. He's best known to a lot of us as the New Yorker's fiction editor for about 40 years, perhaps the single most influential editor at the New Yorker in its history, certainly one of them. In that 40-year period of hugely important sort of literary role in selecting and culling and working with authors for the New Yorker's fiction section. Also wrote himself many books, 6 novels among other works as well, and had a really interesting personal experience with the pandemic that he turned into the text, the focus for his second novel. He was 10 during the pandemic. He himself became very ill from it and lived, but his mother died, again, a young person in that sort of young adult category of life, and he was sent away, raised by an aunt and uncle as a result, and makes that experience the focus of his really moving and under-remembered second novel, They Came Like Swallows, which is about an autobiographical light character, his family, and how particularly 3 men in the family all deal with the loss of Elizabeth, the mother figure who passes away as Keepers Maxwell's mother had. And measuring, I think the quote here from one of the reviews of the book that I wanted to highlight, I think the really nice thing that I like in that review is that it's the subterranean currents of love and need, but also of history, right? Even by the 30s, as I just documented, the pandemic was subterranean in a lot of ways. It was buried. And so it was up to authors like Porter and Maxwell, among others, to try to unearth it a little bit, to try to dig into it, to engage a bit with those histories and stories, autobiographical ones, but certainly also collective ones, social and cultural and historical ones. And then the last author and text that I want to highlight is one of my very favorite American poems by one of my favorite American writers, William Carlos Williams. He's just a great American modernist poet, period. He's best known maybe for his short poems like So Much Depends Upon the Red Wheelbarrow, or the very often turned into a meme these days, Please Forgive Me, that's not how it starts. I have eaten the plums that were in the refrigerator. They were so sweet and juicy. That William Carlos Williams poem is widely out there these days as an often parodied and memed text. But he writes a huge number of really interesting modernist poems as well as a novel and other works over his long career, none of which is focused on writing. He is a physician. He's a trained and lifelong family doctor for his whole professional career from 1912 through the 1940s, works as a doctor throughout the influenza pandemic, for example, and writes really movingly about that work as well. There's a collection of stories collected by the educator Robert Coles as the Doctor Stories, published posthumously, which is a really beautiful set of writings about his experiences as a physician, as a family physician, and the many different people and communities that he engaged and worked with through that. But I would also argue very early after the pandemic, he writes what I would call the best pandemic literary text that we have. And one that, again, for decades I loved without thinking about it as a pandemic text because I didn't think about the pandemic. And that's despite the first word of it. I'm going to share it with you in a second, or not the first word, but the first line, which makes clear that it is a pandemic text, I would argue. And yet I did not think of it that way. I thought of it as symbolic, metaphorical, World War I, lost generation, human experience, all of which is in there. But this is a pandemic text as well, and an incredibly powerful one that I want to end here with because it has things to tell us, I would say, in 2022 as well. And that is Spring and All, the title poem. It's not actually necessarily titled that. It's just the first poem in a book of poems called Spring and All that Williams publishes in 1922. It's I think his first full collection. He's a very young still, particularly as a poet. He's been working as a doctor for about a decade. So it sometimes is titled The First Line, By the Road to the Contagious Hospital. But either way, I'm going to end just by sharing this with you, and then get to my contact info on the last slide, but then come out for the conversation for the last bit. So this is William Carlos Williams' really moving 1922 poem, Spring and All. By the road to the contagious hospital, under the surge of the blue mottled clouds driven from the northeast, a cold wind. Beyond the waste of broad, muddy fields, brown with dried weeds, standing and fallen, patches of standing water, the scattering of tall trees. All along the road, the reddish, purplish, forked, upstanding, twiggy stuff of bushes and small trees with dead brown leaves under them, leafless vines. Lifeless in appearance, sluggish, dazed spring approaches. They enter the new world naked, cold, uncertain of all, save that they enter. All about them, the cold, familiar wind. Now the grass, tomorrow the stiff curl of wild carrot leaf. One by one, objects are defined. It quickens, clarity, outline of leaf. But now the stark dignity of entrance. Still, the profound change has come upon them. Rooted, they grip down and begin to awaken. And just a couple last things I'll say here. This is obviously a poem about not just pandemic or disaster, catastrophe, but post, aftermath, but not aftermath in the sense of forgetting, right? Of coming into that world, of being in that world, and of trying to think about what's next, what the future holds, how one lives, but especially maybe how what's new and young lives in that. I have two teenage sons who I think about coming of age in a lot of ways over these last couple of years. Pretty much every day I think about that and what that's going to mean, and even more so, of course, for younger kids. I think this is a poem that's very much about that as well. Williams worked a lot with families and birth and children, and thinking about what it means to move forward in a world that's been affected in this way. And I think it's a really beautiful examination of those questions as well. All right, as I mentioned, contact info, I'll just leave this up here for a second and then get out of my screen sharing, but I'm happy to send the slides along if that will help, and that would have the contact info, as I say at the bottom there, but also happy to send electronic copies of either of my last couple of books, which I have e-copies of, and I'm happy to send to people if you're interested, so I just wanted to mention that as well. Let me know. Email's a great way to reach out. Lots of ways that you can find me if you're interested, and keep the conversation going beyond the few minutes that we have to keep the conversation going right now. So I'm going to unshare and look forward to hearing some more thoughts and follow-ups from you. Thanks.
Yep, we do have let's see, Raina Rago would like to know if the 1918 to 1920 influenza led to a spike in mental illness, particularly depression and anxiety, as we are experiencing in the current pandemic.
Yes, I believe it did. Obviously, documentation for mental illness was not great in that period. It's not necessarily great now, but it was really not great in the 1920s. But I think, for example, Christopher McNichols, the historian I mentioned, has written about some ways in which sort of narratives around insanity or mental illness developed in the 1920s that seem to be affected by or connected to the pandemic. So, yeah, and I think, again, if we think about the lost generation, there's a middle ground between like physical loss and literary figures like Hemingway, which is just thinking about the psychological, the emotional experience, particularly, again, of young people, not only kids, but 20-somethings, young people up through young adulthood. And I think that phrase can be really useful, kind of usefully reclaimed to think about, things like psychological and emotional shared trauma. And not just the trauma of World War I, as we so often have thought about it, but maybe even more the trauma of this pandemic. So yeah, I think that's in there. I think it's hard to trace sometimes. There are people who are doing that, but it's definitely in there. Yeah.
And Nancy Quimby said that she read that Woodrow Wilson never publicly mentioned the pandemic. She wonders if that's true.
I have seen that referenced as well. I haven't, I haven't gone through his, all of his speeches or anything to verify. And I have my problems with Wilson, so I don't want to just assume that he didn't, just because it makes me feel better about having problems with him. But yes, I mean, again, it was not only underplayed, but if you think about what does happen, I mean, I didn't mention this in the talk, so I'll just mention it briefly, right? 1919, the other thing that happens in America in 1919 is, well, a couple things, huge upsurge in racial violence, right? Racial terrorism. It's called sometimes the Red Summer of 1919, but it wasn't just the summer. It was February to October. There were 40-some different incidents of massacres and lynchings of African-Americans throughout the US, not just the South by any means. So that's happening throughout 1919, right in the aftermath of World War I in the US, among other things, and while the pandemic is raging. And so too are things like the Palmer raids, these targeted governmental attacks on threats to the United States from agitators, anarchists, journalists, spies, all these narratives of these threatening forces in the US. So all of those histories that are unfolding are about sort of threats, perceived threats that the US is facing from others, whether it's African-American veterans or foreign radicals. And I think all of that maybe is part of how the government and the nation sort of redirect to all these other threats rather than the pandemic, which is such a present and shared threat. So it wouldn't surprise me anyway if that was true of Wilson. I have seen that reference because, again, he focuses the federal attention in a lot of ways on these other threatening forces like radical journalists. So I think that's a really interesting connection too. Yeah.
Okay, and the last comment is from Tom Morgan, who refers to the gap, perhaps evidence of a sense among the survivors of the inevitability of contracting it and dying from it. He said there were best practices to mitigate infections, but no useful vaccines.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And even more of an indictment of our own moment, I suppose, because we have this one thing for sure that was not yet present, right? And I mean, if you look at the history of vaccines, one thing that fascinates me is that even after the influenza pandemic, the first people who try to really push for vaccination of things like polio are hugely targeted, are seen as real dangers, are sort of shouted out of like meetings of medical professionals into the 1930s and after. So it was a long time before vaccination was seen as a real possibility. And it certainly wasn't during the influenza pandemic. But yeah, I think that sense of inevitability is a really important point to try to cast our mind back to. Not that we have to fully. I certainly am feeling it at the moment in a lot of ways here in January 2022, but even more so in an era when both the absence of things like vaccines and obviously of a medical system that struggled to treat people who it seemed like luck if you survived. That certainly is how people like Porter and Maxwell write about it, that they felt lucky to have survived it and that it was equally bad luck on the other side, that people they knew had passed away, that it was sort of a game of chance entirely. So I think that all plays into the gap or the desire to forget, to move beyond it for sure.
And Irene Hatherley notes that her grandmother came to this country from Greece in 1915. She gave birth to 3 children, including Irene's mother, during the years of the pandemic, but she never spoke of the pandemic to Irene, to her granddaughter, only the Depression. Does this seem unusual?
I mean, no, not in my experience. Again, I can't speak to families and individuals too fully, but collectively, I think that's a really there's this interesting gap, right, in the way that we talk. And again, it goes to some of the things that we were just talking about and others that we have talked about. But yeah, it is, there is this lacuna, this hole, and there's a lot of holes in our collective memories, but in terms of things of this size and scale and effect, again, even just the 750,000 who are killed, which is on par with something like the Civil War, right? And just to think about this absence, even maybe in family memory and stories. I mean, my grandparents were alive during this time. They were kids, but I certainly I never talked about it with them. They never talked about it or raised it in terms of their families or their parents or their experiences. So it was, I think, a shared gap compared to, say, the wars on either side of it and the Depression and other things. I think that's a fair.
And we do a couple other comments. I guess Michael Riley wants to know what instead of referring to this as the Spanish flu, what should we really be calling it? I mean, we've called it the 1918 influenza pandemic.
Right, which is a long, awkward thing. And that's partly maybe why Spanish flu caught on. It rolls off the tongue for sure, a lot more than that. And influenza is obviously, the problem with that is just that influenza predates and postdates this, right? There have been plenty of influenzas over the years, and even you could say potential pandemics. There was another one in the 1960s, right? The early 1960s, there's another really striking influenza pandemic in the US. So I guess 1918 is my best answer to that. The 1918 pandemic, I think, is a shorthand way. It's still shorthand. It's still inaccurate in terms of the multi-year effects and so on, but it's at least more neutral, right, than that darn Spanish connection. So.
Yeah, that's good to know that was a myth because they could publicize it when other people were not publicizing it. Let's see, we have a couple more comments here. Raina Rego says, I read somewhere that George W. Bush Sr. put a serious committee with funding in place to deal with future pandemics after he read a historical book about the 1918 to 20 pandemic. Do you know if that's true?
I think I just saw in a follow-up comment, and I think that this is right. I think it was Junior, and I think it was the book by John Barry, which is a really great book. One of the ones that I definitely would mention about the 1918 pandemic is John Barry's history. In some ways, the first big one since that one in the 70s that I mentioned from the guy who cited Catherine Ann Porter in his epigraph. Barry's book was one of the first to kind of try to redirect us to this forgotten pandemic, this forgotten moment. And it did, at least for a bit, really hit influentially. And I think that included up to the presidency, as I remember it.
Well, excellent. Well, I think that kind of sums up all the questions we've had. And I want to thank you very much for a very informative, presentation. You've given us a lot to think about, the remembering of versus the forgetting and, being quick to forget it. It's interesting for me, this has been like 100-year phenomenon, and over 100 years, a lot can get lost. But, it's on the other hand, when you're living through it, it's so overwhelming that, I think we can be thankful that today we have vaccines and therapeutics and ways to mitigate its effect. That's definitely been a blessing compared to what people had to endure in 1918 to 1920. So we should be thankful for any mitigating effects that help us survive. But I want to thank you for an informative presentation. I just want to say for the Historical Society, our next program is going to be Monday, February 7th at 7 p.m. Also on Zoom, it will be titled Made in Worcester with Mr. William Wallace, who's the Executive Director of the Worcester Historical Museum. He's going to tell us how the Happy Face, shredded wheat, and Robert Goddard's rockets were all made in Worcester, along with the envelope and other things you'd be surprised to know. So we hope to see everyone then. And I just really like to thank you for your presentation this evening, Professor, and thank everyone for attending. And just wish you all a good evening and a good night. But thank you. It was really very interesting and gives us a lot to think about in terms of how we pass on our experiences to others. I will say our library had us write diaries about our experience in the early pandemic. I wrote one entry, and I contacted a friend of mine who was a writer to ask her to write, so that there's a record of, how we dealt with this, what it felt like, what it was like to live through. And I think it is important to just document our history as we go and not let things be forgotten.
Seconded.
So,
I agree.
so thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation, and yeah, we're getting a lot of accolades here. Thanking you for a very informative presentation.
Well,
So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And
Great to be here.
yeah, and you are part of the WISE program also, right? At
Yes.
Assumption College. That's where Chris Allen heard your presentation. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I appreciate you attending. And I wish everyone a good night.
Yeah, be safe, and please keep reaching out if people have further thoughts. Love to hear from you.
Okay, we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much.